Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
Episode 8, Which Training Collar is Best? Hey guys, welcome back to the Dog Trainers Podcast. My name's Mariano, that's Brent. Now, here's a question that we get a lot online. What dog training collar is the best? And it's something that it's not exactly a simple answer because there's so many different training collars out there, and there are so many for a reason because, of course, dogs have various different issues that people want to work on. Owners themselves can be different. Approaches can be different. There's so many different nuances to training that we want to make sure that we break down maybe a few of the major ones, when and how they'd be appropriate, and then maybe give you some feedback with that. So let's dive right in. Where did you want to start?
Okay. I guess let's go ahead and start off first. Like, what is a training collar, right? Because there's so many different types of collars. There's like, decorative collars that people can buy. There's, different types of face harnesses and all this different things. What we're just talking about specifically in this particular episode is training collars. So the way I define training collars is very simple. Training collars are usually things that go around the dog's neck that constrict if the dog pulls and relaxes if the dog stops pulling, right? So we call this the collar is a live collar, meaning it constricts and it loosens with the movement of the dog. And so there's a bunch of them. You guys may have seen these, may not know what they're called, but let's go ahead and list them real quick. If we were to start at some of the very, very basic, we have an English slip lead, right? So this is usually a piece of rope that has a loop at the very end and it has a piece of leather as a stopper, and that's a slip lead. The cousin of the slip lead is the slip collar, which is just the rope part that goes around the dog's neck. Then we have the cousin of that, which is the choke chain, right? Which is just a slip chain that goes around the dog's neck. A lot of people are very familiar with that because a lot of dogs, that used to be the training collar of choice about 20 years ago. Then we have the Martingale, right? The Martingale was designed for greyhounds or dogs with very slender necks, right? So if you guys have seen a greyhound before, their neck and their head is closely to the same width. So usually putting on a different collar on them that didn't constrict with them, it was very easy for those dogs to slip out of those collars. And then as we start going further and further into different types of training collars, then we start running into like prong collars. And then we can keep going and look at remote collars, right? Or what people refer to as e-collars. And I think, did I miss any collars? Can you think of?
Not really. I mean, Star Mark collar, the plastic.
Yes, Star Mark plastic prongs, and they're all kind of similar variations of each other. But pretty much the whole thing that they have in common, with exception to the e-collar, is that they tighten and release with the dog's movement. So that's what we constitute as a training collar.
Yeah, I want to point out just in the very beginning of this whole thing, because when we talk about, let us be clear in this answer, and I hope that people can go into this podcast already kind of expecting or at least understanding this. It's not really going to be possible for us to say this one training collar is the best. We have maybe our personal favorites, or we have favorites for particular types of dogs / owner combos. But what we can, I think, agree to up front is the idea behind a training collar. That's a good thing to bring up, because the difference between a training collar and a collar is training collars are designed with something in mind, and that's to be able to very accurately mark certain moments in time. There's a reason why the collars constrict. Even if we look at something like the more entry-level stuff, like you talked about the English slip lead. So why that versus a regular collar? So if you have a dog on a regular collar, it's possible that the dog can pull, and the collar, because it doesn't constrict in any way, just continues to be kind of applying downward pressure to the bottom of the dog's throat as they pull themselves down the street. Whereas an English slip lead tightens altogether. So that pressure underneath the dog's neck is sort of more dispersed all around.
Right.
Now, that could lead to a little more of a safe situation if everything else is equal and the dog is pulling on this versus this. But when we talk about actual training, if you wanted to start marking that behavior with, let's say, a leash pop, the dog would have a little more of a clearer understanding with the slip lead versus the regular collar, because the slip lead, because it contracts, is more of a precise grab, mentally speaking.
Right.
And the other collars are meant to do that exact same thing.
Right. And one thing that we see that training collars have a benefit over normal house collars or decorative collars, because they constrict, they interrupt what's known as the dog's natural oppositional response. Right. So the natural oppositional response, like if you guys have ever had experience walking a dog on a normal collar, you're going to see that the dog pulls, and for some reason, it seems the more you pull back, the stronger the dog gets. Right. And this is one of the things that we see happen with just normal collars. And so the oppositional response is very simple. It's the more, if you feel something holding you back, our natural response to that is going to be to pull away from it or to fight the oppositional force, right? And so this is normal. One of the big reasons dogs pull is usually because we're pulling them back, right? And it's kind of this chicken or egg thing. We increase pulling by pulling back. And what training collars allow us to do, they allow us to grab the dog's attention and bring them to be present in consciousness, right? So for example, dog pulls against a slip lead, that slip lead tightens up around the dog's neck. All of a sudden the dog goes, what is this around my neck? And it brings their focus to the present moment of what they might be doing. Now, this is not to say that dogs can't choke themselves on choke chains, martingales, things like that. It's going to be a lot easier for us to communicate to the dog, hey, stop focusing on that in front of you and be very present with us here in the moment. Now, I just want to just follow up that statement by saying, every training collar has a technique that follows with it, right? So the way I use a pinch collar is going to be very different than the way I use a slip lead, and the way I use a choke chain is going to be very different than, let's say, the way I use an e-collar or a star mark, right? So there are techniques, and again, remember, these things are tools. The tools by themselves, if misused and mishandled by any practitioner or dog owner or novice dog trainer, it can be bad if the person doesn't know how to use it efficiently. And sometimes we see that the wrong collar is put on the dog, and that's probably why it's being used inefficiently, right?
Yeah, 100%. I've seen that quite a few times where we have a dog who, comes in for training with one collar on, and we talk about a different type of collar and why it may be beneficial. And
Right.
there absolutely is certain techniques that people should know when working with a certain type of collar, because they are different. Even if the collars
Right.
seem really similar, like a star mark to a prong collar or a slip lead to a choke chain, or
Mm-hmm.
um, but two, I think a lot of it just kind of boils down to the dog and where they are. I've met a lot of dogs who, you know, let's say that they, obedience wise, learned perfectly well on like a prong collar and they look sharp and everything. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of excitement levels, like the, dogs that are reactive toward a skateboard or something like that, sometimes these dogs can be more receptive to, let's say, an e-collar over the prong collar or vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
or, um, and so it's not necessarily our wish to try to push you in one direction or another. I think the best advice that we can give anybody, and the most responsible advice that we can give to anybody would be, do your research, try things out, of course, safely and appropriately. Any tool, I don't care how, which tool, any tool used inappropriately can be dangerous. So don't get scared of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
horror stories online of this color or that color. Um, Make sure that you buy quality stuff, because that's a risk factor too that you can
That's
easily sidestep.
huge.
And if it's pricey, like I know decent e-collars can be pricey, but it's cheaper than a vet visit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
True.
and with that being said, look into it, consider trying it out if it's something that you think you can see yourself doing, because if you're not consistent, you're just wasting your time and money. Um, and if it is something that you can see yourself trying, go for it. And if the dog responds better than something else, be open to the possibility. Be open to the possibility that your dog likes it better for whatever the reason. And we can get into them in a little more detail in a bit. I just wanted to make sure that we prefaced, this idea along with the idea of timing and how these things are supposed to work, so that as people listen to this, they can kind of navigate this with a little easier time.
Yeah. One thing I want to also make clear, because there are so many other devices. I mean, mostly the biggest the biggest issue people have with training collars or anything that goes around the dog's neck is obviously the fear of the dog choking themselves, hurting themselves on their necks. right? So concept, things like weakened tracheas and, all that stuff. Those are real things. I just want to say that. However, I've noticed that dogs who do have, weak tracheas, obviously the dog can have a genetic weak throat. But there are dogs who have, damaged tracheas because I guarantee consistently through that puppy's childhood, they grew up pulling on something before the training collar was even introduced, right? So many times I'll hear people say, my vet said I shouldn't put the dog on a collar because he has a weak trachea. Well, this is even kind of more of a reason for you guys to start dogs on training collars when they're a little bit younger. I would say maybe 6-7 months, because they're getting bigger, they're getting stronger, and you don't want that dog to have many, many months, maybe even a years of pulling and hurting and straining their neck muscles and their trachea, because they are delicate and you can hurt the dog. And that's why it's really important to know what the right collars are to help shape and develop certain behaviors. And then the most important behavior is walking properly on a leash.
So with that being said, starting dogs young, that's a very valid reason. And here's another one. When you start a dog younger, and I would also couple this with start them young and do a full-on obedience program.
And proper training.
You're
Yeah,
right,
proper
right.
training.
Don't be one of those people that like buys the collar and just puts it on and treats it like a collar. I've seen, as in treats it as a regular collar. I've seen way too many people
put tags on their training collar, or put tags on their prong collar.
Yeah, but what really gets me is people have you I know you've seen it because I think it's the same person that we're talking about, but who put a prong on their dog and just left it on like it was a training, like a regular collar rather.
Yeah.
It was loose enough to be like a collar and it was just on.
Yeah.
And we're like, does this thing ever come off? And we take it off and the skin under there was all nasty and it was
Yeah.
I see people walking their dog with a prong collar, but the dog is pulling as if it was anything else. And I can't stress it enough. Make sure that you do the work. But to get back to the young dog thing, do the work when they're young and work them with the collars when they're young, when they're minimally, willing to like push back and they're just in a kind of more compliant, more happy-go-lucky, food drivey place, so that the sort of like bell curve of learning how to yield to leash pressure is as smooth as possible. Because like we talked about last time, the Lima still applies to balance training, and we don't want working with the training collar to be harsh in any way. It's definitely beneficial for dogs to understand the importance of yielding to leash pressure, but that doesn't need to be a negative thing. Dogs can have lots of fun working with a leash, and I think it's the job of a good trainer. I think Michael Ellis does a really good job of it. Your guy Tyler Muto does a really nice job of this. You do a really good job of this too, of working leash pressure with dogs, but finding the nice balance of food too, and play and praise too. That when you're pressuring a dog with with a certain thing because you want them to learn how to perform under pressure because it's a helpful skill, the dogs can enjoy this. It's a funny thing that people. It's a like hard thing, I guess, for some people to like understand until you see it, and then it's and then you realize it's not what you might think it is.
Right. And just those of you who are listening, whether they be young dog trainers who don't know about it or dog owners who don't know about this either, leash pressure work or fixing or reversing the dog's oppositional reflex, in essence, is teaching the dog that the leash is a communication tool. So as we talked about before, a dog's natural response to being on a leash is going to be to pull. Right. So if something's pulling them back, their natural response is going to want to be to break through that force pulling on them. So what our goal is we really want to teach the dog to, if I pull you back, it means to give me a certain response. And so that's what Mariano's talking about to develop with food. If I pull you to the left, it means go to the left. If I pull you to the right, if I pull you down, it means to go down. If I pull you up, it means to sit. And there's so many different variations of leash pressure in between. But the whole idea is to take the leash and instead of it just being a tool that we use to hold the dog back, we're actually using it as a communication tool so that our dogs learn, oh, hey, this leash is trying to tell me something. I should respond to the leash. And so this really, brings down this idea that training collars are abusive, or mean or aggressive or tough. They can be mean and aggressive if all you're doing is yanking the shit out of the dog. Right. So with proper leash pressure training, we start teaching dogs, especially at a young age, we start teaching them to actually enjoy the communication that they receive on a leash. So that way, in the back of the dog's mind, the dog's not getting associating any pull or tug or gesture on the leash with something that he did wrong, right? Instead, it's just kind of a reminder to continue a certain behavior or stop a certain behavior.
Yeah, I always like to tell people, if you try to like bully a dog into listening, it doesn't quite work that way.
No,
So,
definitely not.
It's and I've never really actually had to tell somebody, like because they were doing too much. It's just, sometimes if somebody's afraid of a certain collar or another, I'm like, you guys understand, it's not about like just kind of making this dog do exactly what you want as if you're like a warden and he's in jail. It's
right.
It's a matter of teaching the dog how to pay attention when it's appropriate. They can still have their fun when that's appropriate, and it's our job as humans to understand the difference, because ultimately I can definitely see, we try to be, of course, like reasonable and understanding, and like I can see where people have a problem with certain collars. I get it. I wasn't always a dog trainer. I understand. But at the same time, just over time, it's hard to feel a negative, sort of way toward these collars when you just see them do so much good for dogs with like serious
Right.
issues. And it's even harder to feel that sort of negative way when a dog who was trained on a certain collar gets so much better and therefore doesn't make a mistake that could like ruin his life.
Right. Ruin
Like
his life or ruin his training experience,
right.
right? Like here is the criteria I would recommend. So the question here is, what is the best training collar for my dog? This is the criteria I want you guys to go over in your head. Okay. Whatever training collar you are using at the moment, you have to look at how well does it grab my dog's attention. Okay, how well does it grab my dog's attention in low level distraction, medium level distraction, and high level distraction? Okay, and it is very, very possible you may have to use different tools for those different levels of distraction. I just want to throw that out there. Okay, so that's number one. The whole purpose of a training collar is to grab the dog's attention with the minimum amount of force. Remember that, with the minimum amount of force, so that way we can grab the dog's attention, give them feedback, or teach them something. Right. The point of a training collar is not to hurt the dog or correct the dog or piss the dog off or anything like that. That is actually the malpractice of training collars. Right. And there's been many times, even in my own career, where it's like, okay, I've started a dog on a collar that's been great for them, except for when they see a skateboard. Then I realize that collar pisses that dog off. Right. Or except for when the dog starts lunging at another dog, that collar actually pisses the dog off. So in those scenarios, we actually might have to convert to different training collars to not upset the dog or create more frustration in the dog in that circumstance. Right. So the whole point of a training collar is grab the dog's attention with the minimum amount of force, so that way we can lean and move closer towards more positive feedback and positive reinforcement, right? That is the goal here.
100%. And that should be the goal for all methodologies of training all the time. And be as positive as you can be. If you need to grab a dog's attention, then do. It's better, it's better your collar does it than like the other dog when he runs into it, or the car when he runs across the street. But as positive as possible should be the goal for all dog training all the time. So with that being said, let me dive into, I did this blog post a while back, and it was prong collar versus e-collar, the how they're similar, how they're different. And we'll get into other types of collars too. I just wanted to, since I've already written this and it was like in my head.
These are two, like the two hot buzz.
Yeah.
The most controversial collars. So we'll talk about these a little bit more, because it's important that people are educated on these tools, because used properly they can actually make a huge difference. For most people who go, I've tried everything and my dog still doesn't listen, I guarantee they didn't try these two collars.
Right. Or they were reluctant, or
or they were reluctant, or they didn't use it properly. Go ahead.
So I'm going to break this down to on leash and off leash, because of course I get this question a surprising like amount of time. If you consider e-collar, that doesn't necessarily mean that your dog is like guaranteed to be an off-leash dog. You can have an e-collar on and a leash. So when we talk about on-leash training, prong collars and e-collars, the difference, the way that I've seen it in my experience, is they can do a similar job, but the prong collar on a leash can be a little simpler because it kind of happens on its own. If a dog is pulling he runs into the end of his leash, the prong collar is gonna grab his attention before you really even need to do anything. It's doing it for you. You basically
Right.
have to sit still. The e-collar, you have to sit there and hit a button, which means one hand on button, one hand on leash, and it can get a little clumsy, but it does have its benefit because, of course, e-collars can be dragged out in terms of a correction. You can press and hold a button for a while, whereas a prong collar, in order to be effective, it has to be sharp, pop, 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 not literally sharp,
Right.
but sharp in it.
They're just momentary
Right.
correction.
Correct.
That's all you have.
Right. And that's when you need to kind of assess, does my dog respond well to these momentary corrections, or do they respond a little easier to the kind of, more sparsed out, like longer form correction? And you can still correct momentarily with an e-collar. That's worth noting too. But again, in my experience, a prong collar tends to be simpler for people. It's got less of like a harsh learning curve to it, and it's way cheaper. That's a cool one. They're endlessly reliable. It's a piece of stainless steel. It's really hard to mess that up.
Yeah. Yeah. However, they do look like medieval torture devices. We'll be very upfront with that.
Some people like that.
No, some people are in there like, yeah.
Okay, well,
like your girlfriend. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
She can't hear you, thank God.
Okay, good. Thank you, Lord.
She hears me though. So, okay, well, but here's a real one though. Here's a real cool one. Prong collars, because this can matter to people. Not only are they cheaper, but they come in like cool different colors and things like that. I've seen like black powdered coats or like sage green powdered coats. Sometimes that matters to people, And I've even seen some, I don't know how effective they are, so keep this in mind, but I have seen some that it's like a full-on prong collar covered by like a collar, like a nylon just collar. So it's like hidden away.
Like Velcro collar.
Or something, right. So in terms of efficiency on a leash, they're pretty neck and neck, I would say.
Badoom. Neck and neck. You're hilarious.
Here's a downside that I've seen for each of these collars. Okay, so a downside for the prong collar, I've noticed this most in either really high drive or short fur, or like a combination of the two dogs. A high driven dog with short fur on a prong collar can irritate their neck. Whereas the
if they require a lot of reminding.
Right. Correct. Right. Yeah. So that's when you kind of have to judge, whether your dog is more capable of listening to this versus this. Because I had a few dogs who did well on a prong collar. Don't get me wrong, did really well. But then I moved them to the e-collar and they did much better with much less correcting, no issues with their neck and stuff like that. But on e-collars, you still do have to be careful, because if you have the wrong contact, I made that mistake, put the wrong contact points on a dog, or, you leave it on for too long, or you leave it on and stupid little things happen that inevitably will happen. Like it died and you didn't realize it. So you go to push the button and, oh shit, here we go. Nothing's happening. With that being said, when we consider off-leash work, e-collars have abilities that prong collars don't. How do I correct my dog when he's whining in the crate and I'm downstairs? How do I correct my dog when he's in the yard and I'm telling him to come inside and he doesn't listen? How do I stop my dog from bolting out of the door? And if he does, what do I do? So off-leash capability is a huge thing. But of course, when you're working up to off-leash, that's only for a certain amount of people, only for a certain amount of dogs. Not everybody wants off-leash, even if their dog necessarily would be capable of it, unless we're talking like a dog park, which is closed in. So just a few things to keep in mind, and I'm sure that you have some input that you want to toss in there.
I guess if we're talking about the pros and cons of prong collars, e-collars, I remember when I first started doing e-collar, I think, or learning about e-collar, I was so surprised to find out that some dogs were allergic to certain, contact points, right? And when I found out that they made titanium and they made all these different points that affected, and I remember it being such a huge game changer because, some of the common complaints for these collars are like, okay, an e-collar will leave burn marks on your dog. Right. And if you guys have had experience with an e-collar, or you've accidentally left it too long, they're not burn marks. It's called necrosis. In other words, it's a pressure sore, right? So it's kind of like, why do old people who sit in hospital beds or who are bedridden, why do you have to turn them? Is because if not, they'll develop sores on their butt cheeks, on their hips, on their sides, because the pressure is on it for so long that the tissue actually starts dying. So that is a downside. So you do have to be more on top of your e-collar. You need to make sure you find the right points for your dog's fur. So you definitely do need a dog trainer to consult with to at least ask him what's the right points, what should I do to make sure that it's consistent and it's safe, and also you need to make sure you're charging it. You need to make sure that everything's working and everything's paired properly. So anytime you're dealing with technology, you do have to become a little tech savvy in that field. When we're dealing with prong collars, one of the downside that we see, again, one of the complaints that people will say is that the spikes are actually stabbing into the dog, and it totally makes sense why people think this. But if you guys have ever actually used a prong collar, the spikes, given the specific brand, our brand of choice is Hermspringer. I think that is across the board of professional dog trainers. Hermspringer, the German steel brand, is wonderful. They have about 100 years in this industry, not just making dog tools, but they make tools for horses, and they make riding gear and all this other stuff. So it's not the spikes that create the marks on the dog's neck. It's actually the chain mechanism on the dog's neck that creates. Now you can see the same irritation with choke chains. You can see the same irritation with martingales. Anything that has a chain mechanism, unfortunately what happens is the dog's skin and fur will get pulled through the chain, and to the naked eye it will totally look like, especially for a prong collar is always the culprit, it will seem like that welt or that missing bit of hair or that irritated spot on the dog's neck was created by the points of the prong collar. And that's just not the case. The only time the prong collar will actually leave marks on the dog's neck is if it's left on too tight for long periods of time.
Right. Or too loose. That's a big one too.
Or too loose. This is true. And so those are some of the negatives, and that's kind of why, these two things are kind of open for scrutiny. But again, every tool is just a tool. It's how you use it. And if you use it wrong, then, people are totally going to have opinions on it. And I understand, I have empathy for people who have opinions on it. However, it is still important for people to educate themselves on these tools, so that way they can look out for those things.
Yeah, and can I give one more pro to the prong collar, or two more pros, I guess, because when we talk about like the titanium tips for the e-collars for dogs that are allergic to the stainless steel, because dogs can be allergic to prong collars too, but they also make prong collars in different metals. Like Kurgan is a metal that they've made prong collars out of. Or there's a few different types of metals that don't have like this or that type of base metal that dogs would be allergic to. Right. So you still have options even if your dog has like a skin allergy. But here's a big pro for prong collars, or at least for having a dog on leash. Even if you're going to have an e-collar, it's still good to have a dog on a leash. Is the prong collar is basically fail-proof, meaning if I had a dog on an e-collar and he bolts after another dog, if all my training is done and all his recall and everything is down pat and I know his levels and everything is good, I can grab that dog's attention. I'm confident. But I've met people. In fact, my dog Simba and I were out, and my neighbor's dog, it wasn't at home. We were actually both just happened to be at the park. My neighbor's dogs come bolting at us, and I can hear him yelling at them, both of them. It was Kobe and it was like Mamba, and it was like Kobe, come, other dog, come. He's pushing away his little e-collar button. I can see the collars on the dogs, and I can see that they're so loose, like regular collars. They're just kind of doing this, and it was crazy because once the collar just like happened to connect with the dog, he went boom and then kept coming for us anyway. So so this was like early in Simba's training. I hadn't done e-collar yet, so I still had him on a prong, whereas he of course sees two dogs flying at us. He wants to go back, but he's going nowhere. I don't care how like bad he wants to go. He can't bully his way through my prong collar. I'm holding him. I mean, bar of like pulling me over, or
because the dog's attached to you in that scenario, right? So it is foolproof in that sense. I totally get that. And the dog, and it's easier for you to keep that dog next to you in those scenarios.
Right. So keep that one in mind.
Yeah. I'm going to play a little devil's advocate, right? Because I want to make sure that this podcast stays as educational as possible. Right. Sometimes there's been wrong calls that dog trainers make, right? They might put the dog on the wrong collar, and we might say that the dog is too sensitive. I remember one time I put a dog on an e-collar who could literally feel it at a level 1. Which was nuts. Which, like, guys, those of you who have ever worked with e-collars, at level 1 is almost impossible for humans to perceive. but this dog could. So I had to have a workaround. There was a situation where I put a prong collar on a dog, and the dog completely had no idea how to handle that type of control that the dog had on them. So we have to also kind of make these calls from dog to dog. We are going to see that different dogs have different sensitivity levels. Different dogs have different sensitivity levels specifically around the neck.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've met dogs who are bowling balls, English bulldogs, Frenchies, who are just tough little son of a guns. And you can literally pick them up, throw them in the air. They body slam other dogs and they chew each other on, their paws and the rest of their body. But if you put something around that dog's neck, that dog is going to freak the hell out. Right. And so not always is this a result of the training collar. Sometimes it's just a result of the dog's lack of exposure to something being around his neck. So you might see this with dogs who have, maybe never always been on a harness. Right. And then for the first time, we're putting something around their neck. Or you might see it like on a young puppy who is just being introduced to a collar for the first time. So yeah, I just want to tell people that, when we're using some of the more attention grabbing collars, it is possible that the dog may not be ready for them as well. Okay. So if we can we move on to some of the other collars?
Yeah. Sure.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's kind of go down a little bit. Okay. One thing that we've seen is, so right underneath prong collar, if we're going to put things in kind of a hierarchy, is the Star Mark Pro Trainer. This is a great invention because it is a plastic prong collar. It's definitely more delicate on to look at. It doesn't look as ferocious, but it does give you similar quality of control, right? I wouldn't say as much as the prong collar does,
right?
But we started to see that this is like a great happy medium for people who are a little bit more uncomfortable with the actual prong collar itself. So Star Mark Pro Trainer is what it's called. They make them for big dogs. They make them for small dogs. And then that's actually, I haven't had any particular problems with that other than if the dog is very powerful. Mm-hmm. Just remember, guys, the fact that we're working with plastic, we do run the risk of things falling apart or mm-hmm. plastic getting worn out. So that's something we want to pay attention to.
Can I comment quickly on Star Marks?
Yeah.
The thing about them is, I agree with everything that you said, that they're like easier on the eyes, they're easier on the dog. They are, which mm-hmm. technically equates to them like being less effective in a sense than a prong collar, but sometimes that's mm-hmm. exactly what you want. So sometimes like owner aside, even if they don't mind having a metal prong collar, having a Star Mark on is like a tactical decision. I recently had you remember Winston? He was one of my dogs that I was fostering for a rescue, and he was really sensitive. I didn't do much e-collar work with him just because I just never got to off leash with him. And I would do some prong work with him, but he was such a sensitive dog that he just liked his Star Mark so much better because it doesn't have as like strong a quality as a metal prong collar does. Right. The only like really downside I see, because I agree it's plastic, so it gets a little nerve wracking. If I had a really strong pulling dog, I would just go metal prong for safety. But like working with Star Marks, my only problem with them is like putting the little plastic links together can be hard.
Yeah,
that's it.
If you guys think putting a prong collar together is hard,
Star Mark
taking apart and putting together a Star Mark, which is cool because they made it freaking Rubik's cube of a puzzle to take the links on and off. So sometimes I've gotten calls for people to be like, I got my training collar, I just don't know how to size it now. They will literally come into the office just so I can size it for them. So it is a little bit of a trick to it. That'd be a great YouTube video. We should make a YouTube video how to take on a Star Mark.
I know how to do it, and it's hard. Like I see you do it. When I'm at your house, I'll see you like take them on and off, and I'll keep you in mind when I'm doing it. And I'm like, it takes me like 6 times as long.
It's pretty easy.
I break links when I do it. Like I accidentally break it. I'm not
too strong, man. You're too strong. So we got the Star Mark collar. It's a good little step down in sensitivity for dogs. So definitely, if you guys are on the fence with a prong collar, if you guys want to try the Star Mark, go ahead and try it and see if you like it. Remember, the key is what collar is going to allow me to grab the dog's attention with the least amount of force. Okay.
And can I just say one last thing is they're even cheaper than prongs. They're like $10.
Oh my God.
Star Marks are
they're
great.
$10.
Yeah.
Versus prongs are like $35 on Amazon,
right.
Or $25. So it's great. Okay. So let's move down the list a little bit. So I think right under Star Mark, would you say like choke chain?
Choke chain. Yeah.
Choke chain. So choke chain was in a lot of like protection sports and military dog training and all that stuff. The choke chain itself was the collar of choice for many, many years, and there are still trainers today that only believe in choke chain. Choke chain, a couple things that you guys want to keep in mind for choke chain. So the proper name for a choke chain is a slip chain. Okay, because it slips in and out of that ring very quickly. It turned into the choke chain over the years, the same way that the shock collar is actually the remote collar turned into the shock collar, and now it's back to remote collar. So, or it's called e-collar now.
Yeah,
things just kind of evolve throughout the years. Don't let the name choke chain affect you too much, because the whole point of the choke chain is that it has a quick action. Right. So sometimes the jingle of the chain, that sound that the chain makes, they come in different gauges. So usually in my experience, the thinner the gauge of the chain, the more attention it grabs. But obviously we always have to keep in mind the strength and reactivity of the dog that's behind that leash. So, I wouldn't put a really thin chain on a very strong Rottweiler, right? Who's reactive, because that dog will at some point could very easily break through those links. It doesn't matter how strong the metal is. So we have to always make sure that we have the right gauge for the thickness of the dog's neck. And we have to make sure that the action on that chain is smooth in order to get the results that we want. Now, some of the pros that I would say for the choke chain, in my opinion, and throw in any that you have, Mariano, it's sleek. It's very sleek. It actually looks kind of decorative, right? So if you ever seen a dog on a choke chain, it looks kind of nice, right? Like you could put like a pendant on there if you wanted to. So it's easier on the eyes. It can be effective as a training tool. Definitely, we've used them before as training tools for sure. The only difference is if the dog is very powerful or very used to being to showing opposition to things around his neck, sometimes we can see that the choke chain does require a heavier, more forceful correction in order to get the result that you want in grabbing the dog's attention. So just simply based on our philosophy as balanced dog trainers, if you have to really put your back into that correction, it may not be the best. It may not be the best training tool for that dog at that time. Now, I'm just going to bring this up now. Our goal is we do want to phase down in training collars. So sometimes I might start on a prong collar and I might work my way down to like a Martingale, right? Like I got a Martingale right here. So it really just changes based on how well you've conditioned. But that is also the goal, right? So that way we can have control, but maybe a more advanced dog in training may not need as much control as he previously did, because now he's better behaved.
Right. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that I get asked this question a lot. Like, well, somebody brings their dog who pulls like a train to you in a harness, and then you recommend a certain type of collar or another. They're like, okay, well, when can I start walking him on a harness again? And then that's when we have this sort of conversation a lot. With my personal dogs, I walk them on whatever, because they're on e-collars anyway. So other than that, I mean, I'm comfortable with them off leash. I'm comfortable with them on a harness. It really doesn't matter. So it is kind of nice to have that sort of option when the dog is trained, e-collar or not, when they're conditioned properly and you're comfortable that they're going to respond to your boundaries. Then you definitely have, a little more leeway there. To get back to choke chains, the same sort of benefits apply to the Starmark. They're super cheap. They're everywhere. You'll find them everywhere. Like Starmark, prong collars, good proper Hermspringer prong collars. I don't really find them in stores. It's like Amazon or their website or, choke chains you can find in all the different like Petco, PetSmart. They're really hard to mess that up because cheap prong collars are like sharp in their points. They're not supposed to be sharp, so don't buy those. A choke chain, it's kind of, I don't know really how you mess up a choke chain, so it's a bit of a safer bet if you're going that route. It's easier to put on and off. That's a huge one. They do look really pretty. That could be cool. I'm thinking of a few dobies that we can think of with like choke chains on. They're just beautiful.
And they make different types of decorative choke chains, by the way. If you guys go to the Hermspringer website and look at their choke chain selection, they have like 4-road choke chains. They have like all these pretty rings. They have like all these different types of collars that to use on dogs. And they actually have some specifically for certain types of work. They have like a whole collar that looks like a chain link fence. And I remember, it looks great. But yeah, they all kind of have their purpose.
The ones
sorry to cut you off.
No, you're good. The ones that look like tennis chains are funny too.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ones that I think another, the final thing would be when it comes to a choke chain, there are certain shows, if I'm not mistaken, that don't allow like prong collars and stuff, so people use choke chains. They're kind of more widely accepted, I would say.
Yeah, like that, like the AKC, you're not allowed to do a canine good citizen on any type of prong collar or
Right.
star mark. So yeah, that's very normal. I will go ahead and give you guys a little bit of information on the choke chain. So choke chains are sold. They're sized by 2-inch increments, right? So you'll have, like a 12-inch, a 14-inch, a 16-inch, an 18-inch. So they go up in size by 2 inches. And the reason for that is they always tell you want to make sure you have about a good 2-inch tail on that choke chain. So that's how you properly fit a choke chain. However, I do notice in common pet stores, they don't have a great selection of choke chains sometimes. Like sometimes they might have the size before my dog and the size after my dog, and it's just annoying. And nothing makes a choke chain more ineffective than it being too big.
Yeah, or those choke chains that have the nylon like in the links.
Yeah,
In those.
yeah. I like those sometimes, but they definitely don't necessarily have the same speed or the
Yeah,
same
it
action.
messes with the like functionality a little bit to me.
Yeah, the jiggliness of the
Right.
leash.
I'll also say too
Right.
that dogs with big old domes, like bully breeds, that sometimes it's hard to find a good choke because the head is so
I
big,
know they
the
have
neck
some
is so much
big
smaller
heads.
that you end up with the tail that's like 6 inches long, and it just
Yeah,
doesn't quite work out.
yeah. True. Okay, so let's go from that choke chain. If we were going to go down the scale, I would just straight up look at like a slip collar, right? A slip collar in essence is a choke chain that's made of rope. That's all, right? And these ones also are in 2-inch increments. So best way you got to do it is you have to measure your dog's neck and see how many inches it is, and then I would maybe just add 2 inches. If your dog has a fat head, add 4 inches, and you might have a 4-inch tail on it. So that's how that works. The action on the slip collars definitely not as fast as that on a choke chain, right? They can definitely be very useful and cool, cool looking. A lot of times people think that, because it's not chain, that it's not as aversive. I've put one of those slip leads on or slip collars on, and they definitely grab attention. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
And I will go ahead and say the same thing about its cousin, which is the slip lead, right? So the slip collar is just the rope collar, and then the slip lead is actually a 4 foot to 6 foot length of rope that has a loop at the very, very end.
Yeah, I think the same rule applies to the chains. Is the thicker the gauge, the less potent the pull. But a really thin slip lead, it'll grab you.
It'll grab your attention for sure. And so if you guys have ever watched like the AKC or like any type of like the Crufts dog show or something like that, you'll see these handlers with their dogs, and the leashes are pulled up really, really tight behind the dog's ears, which keeps the dog's head up, and they're prancing around the arena. Those are slip leads. Right. Those are really thin gauge slip leads where they can control their dog and keep their heads up and keep their positions. And this is actually a very common tool of choice. And it's so funny because if you put one on, a lot of people think that they are the least painful or the least uncomfortable of training tools. They're right up there with the choke chain and the rope. The rope and the choke chain are right there, very similar. The only difference is the material that they're made out of. Now, one of the benefits, chain over rope, if you have a dog who likes to chew on shit, the chain will probably have to be your better option. I've seen so many people where their dogs chew through their slip lead because they left it on. Even leather leads. If your dog's a chewer and a chomper, the rope's going to be way easier for your dog to go through.
Yeah. Can I say one thing? I notice a lot of people leave the choke chains on the dog. Like we were talking about the one that looks like actual chain links. Be careful with that. I would say just don't do it. It looks cool and everything, and people put tags on them as if they're regular collars and stuff, but I've seen dogs get caught up on their crates or over the wall or something. Fences.
Yep.
Yeah.
There was a dog, and sounds really, really sad. There was a dog who was an escape artist who was a client of mine. And this dog, they left the collar on. The dog jumped over the fence, and his collar got stuck on the fence. Thank the Lord they found him, and he wasn't dead.
Oh, wow.
Thank the Lord. But
Awesome.
this dog was hanging himself from his own neck. because his collar got caught on the fence. Right. So be careful of those things. Obviously, if your dog lives in a property or has a setup where he can't do those things, then don't worry about it. But if your dog spends a lot of time outside or likes to jump and there's things that the dog can snag his collar on, be very, very careful with that, guys.
Or just take it off when when you get home and you put the dog in the yard, take the chain off. But when you're walking out and about, it's a valid tool. It can definitely have its uses. Yeah, when we talk about the rope slip leads and things like that, we're basically now at the bottom of the barrel in terms of like how taboo. I even see, all positive trainers using slip leads. It's they don't necessarily have an issue with it, which is great. I do think that it's worth mentioning because you do bring up the like, the like pressure factor to discomfort that it can give you. It's definitely up there. So don't. I guess the moral of this story is make sure that you do your research, because I think probably the most uncomfortable tool that you could put on a dog, maybe e-collar, maybe like a really thick rope lead, or something along those lines. But when you're
sorry, I would add and agree with this or disagree with this. Actually, don't do your research. Go and actually get the collar and try it out. That's what I would say. Try and develop experience with it, right? Educate yourself. But the problem is don't educate yourself. If you already believe that you hate a certain collar, don't look up articles that say I hate that, how much you should hate this collar. Go out and actually try the collar out to see if it works for you. If you guys have tried a collar that doesn't work, then maybe try one of the other collars in this list and see if it helps.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe I'll have to to adjust that and say, seek out help. How's that?
There you go. That's better. Yep.
I know what you're getting at. We talked about this like a couple episodes ago. People read up on stuff and then a lot of times they just seek out the information that agrees with them already so that they can just tell themselves, I told you so.
They Google search, are choke chains bad?
Yeah. How bad are choke chains, or just Google images, choke chain, bruise marks or something.
Yeah.
So ask for help. Reach out to a professional, reach out to us. We've got our email here, dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. We're happy to answer any questions that you guys have. And we're also happy to make some videos. Like the star mark video is a good idea because that freaking little plastic thing is hard to do.
We'll definitely do that.
But anyway, so just in my own personal experience, okay, so we're not necessarily suggesting, I want to be super clear, this is just my opinion, not necessarily Brent's. In order of what can potentially be the most gentle, I'd probably put e-collar there because they're very like minute, and then maybe I'd put star mark after that. Then maybe we'd start to go to some of the slip collars and stuff after that. Prong collar would actually be surprisingly, doing well on that list too, because I understand how they look and I understand what people think. But the thing is, in practice, this is what he meant when he was saying, do your own, earn your own experience. Because if a dog is pulling, if we were to just put it on a scale of 1 to 10, my dog pulls at a 7 of 10 on a regular like slip lead. And you put him on a prong collar, that dog's not going to be pulling at a 7 on a prong collar.
No.
So you have to consider that, that like differential in pressure that the dog is putting. And so that has to factor into just how minimally, aversive the prong collar can look. So always keep that in mind.
Yeah, for sure. I think all that's just one little last thing. We kind of barely talked about it, the star mark. So the star mark is Martingale. Sorry, Martingale. You're right. It's the Martingale. The Martingale collar. This is, I think I'll put this at the, I don't know. I would actually put this at the bottom of the list. I would put this below slip lead, to be very honest.
Okay.
Only reason I put it on the lowest level of sensitivity for dogs is because of the fabric part. So the part that is nylon, that is an actual collar. Sometimes because that collar is wide, and the only part that's ratcheting is the actual chain itself. Dogs, the wider that the surface area of the collar is, the less the dog feels it, right? And some designs of the star mark or not star mark, Martingale. Or the Premier collar, right? The Premier collar is just a Martingale without a chain,
right? Without the chain on it, right?
It has a fabric chain. But the only thing I would say is the wider that the collar, the fabric part of the collar is, the less sensitive it will be on the dog. And the problem is if we go too thin on the star mark or on Martingale. Keep saying star mark, the Martingale. If you go too thin on the Martingale, sometimes it affects the strength of the actual collar itself. So you just got to take a look at what kind of dog you have, if it's appropriate. But my goal would be, like, if I could, train every single dog to work their way down to a Martingale, right? That would be my goal. Like if my dog responded to the ratchet of this Martingale, if I was going to keep my dog on leash, right, not considering off leash training, I would want my dog to be on a Martingale most of the time, right? And just so I would be able to walk my dog, take him potty, on a Martingale. That would be my goal, but it's not always necessarily the place that we start first.
Yeah, I think it's a valuable goal. I don't necessarily disagree with your goal. My goal is a little different, but that's not to say that I don't like yours. I think mine is just I've always been a little more of the mindset of like be as safe and protected as you can because it's your job to keep your dogs, like healthy and happy. So
Right.
my dogs, for example, are really well trained on e-collars, and I don't ever really plan to move them off of e-collar just because it works so well. And I take them off leash a lot, to be fair. So I'm not slamming anybody who, wants to move down. That's totally valid. I have no problem with it. And if one of my clients wants to do it, we do it. It's not a big deal. But just personally speaking, my dogs, I like the e-collars. They like their e-collars. It's nice to have that sort of like universality of, he's barking out front and I'm in the back and I can just, so it's in my view, do what you need to do to maximize safety and efficiency, because still always keep this in mind. Balanced training, positive training, doesn't matter. Least intrusive, minimally aversive. That works for collars as well. And if my dogs do really well on e-collar, I'm not going to move them to something that's less effective unless, I personally don't see the need, but again, it's not a bad thing. It depends on, people.
Different strokes for different folks, guys.
I knew you were going to say that.
Aha! Stole it out of your mouth. And that's the reality. There's so many types of dogs, guys. So many different sizes, so many temperaments, so many everything. We can't reiterate this enough. The reason there's so many tools, techniques, philosophies, and dog training is because there's so many freaking dogs. We're really hoping that we're doing a good job, at least showing you guys this spectrum of possibilities that exist out there. Anything else you want to talk about, Mariano?
No, I just want to reiterate a couple things. In all training, timing, potency of timing, least intrusive, minimally aversive, that works in all aspects. I don't care if it's food. I don't care if it's a training collar. I don't care if you're mixing them together. Timing is everything. Seek out, certified opinions that can really guide you in the right direction. Try your very best. If you already have a sort of like negative bias or positive bias toward or against a collar, don't go and just reaffirm it on purpose. Right. Learn the actual information from people who you never know, but that collar might just make your training experience better. And other than that, just get to work. Be safe with it. Be patient with all of it, including food, and be willing to the possibility and understand that the goal is not to hurt the dog or bully the dog or and roll with it. See what you can do.
Right. I love that. Awesome, guys. So thank you guys so much for listening to our episode 8 of the podcast, of the Dog Trainers Podcast. My name is Brent LaBrada, and that guy over there is Mariano Alvarez. If you guys have any questions that you'd like to send us, go ahead and shoot it to dogtrainerspodcast@gmail.com. We also wanted to announce, guys, we are now live on all 7 podcast streaming services. We're so happy. So Google, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio. I forget the other ones.
Yeah, tune in.
Do you know them?
Yeah, tune in. Alexa. There's a couple more, but we're there. So look it up.
We're live. We're live, guys. So if you guys have been watching us on YouTube, thank you so much. Click subscribe. If you guys now you guys can totally listen to us in your car or while you're running or walking your dogs. So thank you guys so much, and we look forward to seeing you guys next time. You guys take care. Peace. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend.
See you next time.